Hello, I'm Susan Vita, Chief of the Music Division at the Library of Congress. We are happy to release 3 new video lectures this spring, all a part of our American Musicological Society and Library of Congress lecture series. Look for all 3, as well as streaming videos of past AMS lectures on the library's website, as well as the library's YouTube channel. Today we are delighted to hear a presentation from Candace Bailey, Professor of Musicology at North Carolina Central University, who specializes in women in music in the 19th century United States. Dr. Bailey currently serves as an American Studies Specialist with the Fulbright Commission. Her book, Unbinding Gentility, Women Making Music in the Mid-19th Century South, has just been published by the University of Illinois Press. She lectures widely on intersections of music, women, class, race, and culture. Dr. Bailey has spent most of her career at an HBCU, and her most recent research aims to position the long-silenced voices of BIPOC women within the traditional narrative of music history. For the 2020-21 academic year, Dr. Bailey holds a Humanities Unbounded Fellowship at Duke University, where she's preparing a digital project on bound collections of music and investigating microhistory as a methodology. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Candace Bailey with her presentation, Silencing the Guns of War, Women's Music and the Home Front During the Civil War.
I wish to thank Susan Vita, Chief of the Music Division at the Library of Congress, for that introduction, as well as for co-sponsoring this series with the American Musicological Society. I am grateful to both entities for making this series possible, and I appreciate being a part of it, and I'm honored to be here. The staff in the Music Division have been so helpful through the years I've been coming to the library. As anyone who works there knows, they're wonderful. Particular members of the staff of the library whom I wish to acknowledge for their assistance in making this presentation possible during the pandemic are Caitlin Miller, David Plyler, and Paul Summerfield. Finally, I would be remiss if I didn't mention up front Karen Stafford's dissertation, Binders Volumes and the Culture of Music Collectorship in the United States, 1830 to 1870, and the data she has made public. It has proved invaluable in assessing details in the sources while the library is closed to visitors. Among the many treasures in the Music Division at the Library of Congress are more than 300 binders volumes, most from the 19th century. These are books to which have been bound individual pieces of sheet music, usually printed by the mid-19th century, but occasionally still in manuscript. Here are 2 from the Music Division. They are pretty consistent in size because most publications ran about 12.5 inches tall and 10 inches wide, with the number of pages inside each volume being the variable. On a good number of them, the owner's name appears on the cover, as on these. An overwhelmingly large percentage of the surviving binders volumes belonged to women, which means they are a rich source of information about women's culture, as well as musical practice. In many instances, these are the only physical artifacts that survive to testify to a given woman's cultural identity, even to her existence. They manifest a tangible, specific historic actor, moving us beyond conjectured generalizations to lived experiencing. 19th century musicking, that is the action of making music, comes alive through them. One contribution to our understanding of music history in the United States that derives from close readings of binders volumes is that they negate even the suggestion of a monoculture of American women in this period. For although they are similar in shape and sometimes content, each one is a unique representation of a woman's life at a given time in a given place. This awareness runs counter to that described in existing musicological narratives because men, as individuals, have been the framework upon which such histories have been built. Amateur women almost certainly the largest group of consumers of music, remain nameless and faceless and have been shunted to the side, or rather, to the parlor. That we have neglected to represent this large constituency of practitioners stands as an indictment to historiography. To have a more complete picture will require constructing microhistories, gleaning what we can from them, and then situating them within networks defined by various parameters. To that end, after an introduction to the Library of Congress collection, I will focus on albums from the Union during the Civil War in order to demonstrate how crucial it is that we include the practices evident in them as part of the music history narrative. Those belonging to politically influential families will figure most prominently. All of the women I have identified thus far in the Library of Congress have been white women, but it is entirely possible that some of the collections whose provenance eludes us thus far belong to BIPOC musicians. There is much more work to be done. Well over 100 owners can be identified in the Library of Congress collection, and their stories encompass myriad circumstances, women and men from diverse backgrounds that help make history real. For example, 2 binders volumes connected with Eliza Ridgely and her mother Elizabeth Eichelberger have the potential to enhance our understanding of the cultural meaning in this painting of Eliza by Thomas Sully. And neither of these sources appear in the latest research on the harpist. Similarly, music that belonged to President Millard Fillmore's first wife, Abigail, 2 volumes, and their daughter, Mary Abigail, 2 more volumes, helps situate women practices within a period of U.S. history wrought with great change, the early 1850s. A contemporary of Mary Abigail Fillmore, Laura Josephine Nisbet Boykin of Macon, Georgia, compiled another binder's volume, and it helps fill out references to music in 2 of her cousins' Civil War diaries, Mary Boykin Chestnut and Emma LeConte. In her own recollections of this period, Laura mentions accompanying poet and flutist Sidney Lanier on her Grand. To bring this back around, some of Sidney's music has ended up in Eliza Ridgely's volume, but it's not bound into it. These examples illustrate the social connections lying dormant in many binders volumes and could be mined for how they enrich the lives of those famous women. That is but one direction that they offer as historical narratives. Another avenue proffered by the Library of Congress volumes pertains directly or not to the Civil War. And this path proves to be particularly instructive in both our conceptions of music during the conflict and women's attitudes towards the war. They reflect the social world inhabited by women. The music of the American Civil War is not an obscure topic. Any print or online resource that deliberates music in the Civil War, and there are many, will inevitably go through a series of types of pieces. First, the famous patriotic music, such as the Battle Hymn of the Republic or Dixie. Moving on, there may be rallying cries for the troops, tramp, 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 the boys are marching, or when Johnny comes marching home. Neither is parlor music as a practice or repertory unfamiliar. We are accustomed to scenes where women are depicted performing somber, plaintive, or sentimental ballads associated with the war and loss. Northern men and women were frequently taught that this was the norm. As we can see in small vignettes pictured on this series of songs, this is on both Tramp, Tramp, Tramp and Just Before the Battle, Mother. In addition to the militaristic imagery, we see a gathering bemoaning the vacant chair and a woman sitting wistfully beside a lute whose master has gone, as if anyone played the lute in such homes, nor is that a lute. All of these are viable examples of Civil War music, as this image from Harper's Weekly in late 1861 attests. On the other hand, they do not represent musicking between 1861 and 1865 to the degree that most authors would have us believe. Literature on parlor music and Civil War music often lives outside each other. As scholars, we have allowed an incongruous disconnect between how we describe women's parlor repertory and how we treat music of the Civil War, even though everyone knows they coexisted. Perhaps a tendency to focus on the South, where the conflict's impact seems more visceral, derives as few. Maybe the disconnect is merely syntactical. You see, instead of music of the Civil War, I'm curious about music during the Civil War. To what extent does it confirm what scholars of women's history have written? What agency did women have in parlor performance during the war? Might we reconcile the musical repertory that animates Binder's volumes with non-traditional conceptions of music and the Civil War, perhaps with therapy and trauma? The Library of Congress Binder's volumes substantiate a much wider array of music and its uses throughout the conflict. Upon careful examination, the music that women performed in their parlors varies by place, social position, and myriad other factors, so much so that to generalize about music of the Civil War parlor is at best problematic. Oversimplifications ignore vital evidence that can only be assessed in Binder's volumes. They are much fuller resources than surviving single sheets of music, which we can rarely contextualize. Once fathomed for their individual stories, these music albums reveal alternative realities to expectations drawn from lists of titles and composers, or even numbers of particular compositions sold. The concrete nature of intentionally bound volumes further prompts recognition of practical considerations, such as what music was available. We cannot assume that the same music one could buy in Richmond was also on offer in Charleston. Nor can we assume that what was available in Boston was not also on the shelves in Savannah. The Library of Congress houses just over 60 Binder's volumes compiled in Union states with music published between 1861 and 65. This number deceives, though, because almost 30% of them belonged to only 3 collections, and more about that in a moment. Nonetheless, out of this total, 21 contain music that references the war. Mary A. Lockwood of New York owned the most such pieces. 13, including On, The Boys Came, Tramp, 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 Babylon Is Fallen, Grafted into the Army, Give This to Mother, and Tenting on the Old Tap Ground. These images are not from her volume, COVID Prevented Me Access. These are from the Library of Congress Civil War Sheet Music collection. Aside from the 13 war items, 14 other songs in Mary's volume had nothing to do with the war. Now, later in the 1860s, some women bought souvenir volumes, collections that deliberately included as much war-related material as possible, but these are relatively rare. Each of the volumes shown here could reveal an individual experience of the Civil War and its impact on its owner's life. Collectively, these, and others I will describe, convey an alternative space of musical practice, one that invites us to think about music and trauma, about music as therapy, as well as how cultural norms persisted for some of the population, but not others. If we look to the area surrounding the nation's capital, the geographic region closer to the fighting, we find these sources. If we had time, each of these albums could yield its own story. These are mere samplings of the facts in the source materials. For example, we might question why 2 of Alice Slimmer's 3 wartime compositions dealt with Stonewall Jackson, or why Charles Gounod's opera Faust appears to inch out old Italian favorites by Donizetti and Bellini in 1863 rather precisely, or why there is not much Stephen Foster, or what was the continued appeal of Robin Adair. We could talk about all of this, but for this lecture, I've selected a small assortment of Binder's volumes to exemplify the diverse music heard in American parlors during the Civil War. They justify the need to study such sources meticulously in order to better understand women's music and its meaning during this watershed moment in U.S. history. By unsilencing their voices, we weave a richer tapestry in American culture. The ones I've chosen reflect the provenance in the Library of Congress in general, Union sources, particularly the area in and around D.C. Individually, they tell tales of unique circumstances. Taken together, they challenge our modern ideas concerning the soundscape of the Civil War. I have limited my data to those pieces published during the war years and presumably purchased at that time. In doing so, I acknowledge that women would have still played music they owned prior to the war, and that music vendors would have still had antebellum stock on their shelves. There are other factors that play into how we analyze such data, and the examples here only serve as a starting point. I realize that many other questions probably arise, but unfortunately COVID does not permit the usual discussion after the paper. I would be happy to entertain inquiries by email, and mine will be available on the Library of Congress blog related to this lecture. One example that proves of interest is that which belonged to Annie Houseal of Central Pennsylvania. She put together one of the largest binder's volumes I have encountered. It has 73 songs and is over 3 inches thick. The 1860 U.S. Census lists her as a music teacher with a very modest income, and she may have used much of this music for teaching. Unusually, she owned 3 Confederate songs, Maryland, My Maryland, The Bonnie Blue Flag, and God Save the South. And these images are from her binder's volume. Other songs in her music were pro-Union. And in this slide, the red points out the Confederate ones, and blue is used for the Union. She was not alone in owning music representing both sides. This practice can be found in several women's artifacts, particularly in border states. Each carries its own story as to why, and I've not been able to discern Annie Houseal's reasoning, although her students' family's ties may have had something to do with it. Annie was an unmarried music teacher in a small town, a middle-class woman who typifies the parlor performer described by many authors. Yet even her story yields questions that outline an individual experience, as shown by her mixed patriotic choices. Other Library of Congress binders volumes belong to women in significantly dissimilar families, those who were power brokers in the D.C. area. They allow us to interrogate women's lives in influential families living in proximity to the nation's capital during the Civil War, specifically to gauge how much the war impacted their daily existence, at least as exemplified in their musicking. Consider, for example, the Blair House collection, 5 binders volumes that belong to women connected to the Blair family. I confess that William Sapphire's book Freedom came to mind when I saw Minna Blair on one of the Library of Congress volumes, especially the way he paints ease of social interaction in wartime D.C. Minna was the daughter of Montgomery Blair, Lincoln's postmaster general, and granddaughter of Francis Preston Blair, Sr., an influential politician and journalist editor. She lived in Blair House most of her life. Minna's maiden's aunt's music also forms part of this collection, and these are 4 volumes owned by Ellen Carolina de Quincy Woodbury, daughter of a Supreme Court justice who also spent most of her life in Washington. This is Minna's mother and Ellen's sister, the connection between the 2 women. Even though Ellen was a generation older than Minna, both purchased music during and after the war. Retired senior music cataloger Sharon McKinley drew attention to the Blair House collection in 2013, noting that for, quote, true local color, end quote, the makers of the movie Lincoln, 2012, should have consulted her. This painting of influential political men that figure in the film includes Montgomery Blair, standing on the right side. The Blair House music collection expands our knowledge of the cultural atmosphere surrounding such decision-making. It vivifies life in the Capitol in ways hitherto unexplored. What was this local color to which Sharon McKinley referred? Not surprisingly, it mostly reflects the music popular in the 1850s. Opera, Italian and French, songs by Stephen Glover and Franz Abt, piano pieces by Charles Grobe, who ran a store in Wilmington, Delaware, Robin Adair, and dance music. Each woman I will describe today owned a version of Robin Adair, an old melody that circulated widely in the 19th century. Jane Austen owned it, John Braham toured with it in 1811 to 1813, and Adrien Boieldieu used it in his popular 1825 opera comique, La Dame Blanche. We'll hear a performance of the first verse, sung by Amber Hitchcock. I'd like to thank Amber for making that recording for this lecture. The only war-related title in Minna's collection is Grobe's Hope On, Hope Ever, brilliant variations on Henry Tucker's beautiful song, When This Cruel War Is Over, opus 1470. The other items dating from the war years, listed on this slide, reveal little interest in Civil War music. Ellen's music covers a longer period but evinces the same repertory. Of the 8 pieces published during the Civil War, none connects directly to it. Minna Blair was surrounded by those directly involved in political discussions in Washington during the Civil War. Slightly farther away, the music collection of Laura Cooke offers the opportunity to measure yet another perspective. She was 11, soon to turn 12 when the Civil War began, the formative years when young women learned how to perform their gender within their social circles. Her father, Jay Cooke, has been called financier of the Civil War for his role in raising bond money. His audacious banking moves funded much of the Union's efforts, and his influence was considerable in the 1860s. Laura grew up in Ogontz, with its 52 rooms and 350 acres in a northwest suburb of Philadelphia. My time at the Library of Congress pointed me to the music of Laura Cooke because she owned more volumes of music than almost anyone I have encountered in my research. Her story reminds us of the value of microhistories as we look at the music in the United States. Laura amassed a collection of 15 binders volumes, and there is another one in the collection that has her mother's married name on it. Her music collection was not expanded once she married in 1869. She married Charles Barney of Smith Barney fame. Several of Laura's binders volumes date from the Civil War. However, specific years cannot be determined for much of it because she owned a lot of European and U.S. publications that did not carry dates. And, of course, we cannot always tell when a piece was purchased. In other words, just because a piece was purchased in 1859 did not mean that Laura owned it in 1859. But Laura could have owned any music she wanted. So the likelihood is that her music was pretty up to date. Several prints with dates written in are within months of their publication. Such details matter when we think about Laura's collection. For example, Volume 69 includes mostly piano music from the 1840s and 1850s, but has 1863 written in it after it was bound. Similarly, volume 71, Piano Music from the 1850s, has 1862 written inside. Indeed, I think it very likely that most of this collection came together during the war, and certainly that it was used at this time. Laura would have been too young for much of it before 1861. Her albums appear to have been bound in groups, according to different criteria. For example, Volume 56 contains music from Europe. It differs tremendously from what other young women her age were performing in the United States: Bach, Mozart, and a number of Beethoven sonatas. But that is another lecture. Nonetheless, in an attempt to compare apples to apples, as it were, here is a list of Laura's music that was definitely published between 1860 and 65. Only 2 of Laura's binders volumes contain music that we normally associate with the Civil War. Volume 68 has by far the most. 2 other pieces in Volume 64 are Military Polka, connected with Sheridan, and Lincoln's Funeral March. At the end of Volume 68, whose contents are given on the slide, she included several songs associated with the war. The highlighted items were published during the war. Those in turquoise do not reference it, those in yellow do. While these are significant examples of Civil War music, they are, in fact, not the most striking aspect of her collection. Far from it. More to the point is all the other music she amassed during this period, music that had nothing to do with the war. Out of 380 single publications, only 11 deal directly with the Civil War, less than 3%. Since Laura was only 11 when the war began, and little of her music dates from after the war, we must conclude that she used the bulk of this music during the war. 3 binders volumes include dates on their covers, all of which belong to 1865. The most specific is Volume 63, the cover of which marks April 22nd, 1865. Lee had surrendered to Grant on the 9th. Lincoln died on the 15th. The train carrying his body passed through Philadelphia on the 22nd. It's almost certain that Laura marked the occasion on the cover of this binder's volume. But the volume consists of piano solos and duets, 4 excerpts from Gounod's Faust, Charles Vass's Fantasy on Meyerbeer's Les Huguenots, Rossini's William Tell Overture, and Louis Moreau Gottschalk's duet, Ojos Criollos, among other pieces. Now, I'll play one of the Faust pieces, the Faust Waltz, from the middle of the work, and show an image from 1883 of the Cooke parlor, in which Laura would have performed it. And as we listen to this piece, try to imagine the 14-year-old playing this waltz in, say, the winter of 1864. And not, I might add, on the Titanic. It was featured in the movie. The excerpt is about 2.5 to 3 minutes long. Volume 68, with the expected Civil War music, and Volume 65, Typical Ballads, both have November 1865 on their covers. We can interpret Laura's collection in many ways. Did she not dwell on music of the war because she was too young, or because she was not that interested in it? Or was Laura a musician and interested in music for music's sake, an idea supported by the Beethoven sonatas and other irregularities? Was her choice of repertory part of her confirmation of a woman's place to please others, to perform what others wanted to hear without recourse to her own wishes? What was the proper behavior for a rich young Union lady? Historian Alice Foss outlines a feminized war, created in Northern popular culture that commended women's sacrifice and suffering, and constructed an idealized gender role that allowed them to express a shared commitment to the Union. In his book Defining Duty in the Civil War, Personal Choice, Popular Culture, and the Union Home Front, Matthew Gallman analyzes this further, examining how Northern women were instructed to see themselves and their duties in the war through publications. There was no single right way to be. Examples from 1862 and 63, drawn from Gallman's evaluation and extended on this slide, exemplify the diverse counsel directed at Union women. From Reverend D.W. Clark's almost militant proclamation that women should, quote, detect and expose covert traitors, to Gail Hamilton's directive to inculcate a soul of fire, even in the parlor, and avoid faint-heartedness, to Carolyn Kirkland's response that soul of fire seemed more like rebel women, and that's not a good thing if you can read further on these examples. Northern women received multiple opinions on how to be patriotic. Nonetheless, most agree that the degree of volunteerism and personal sacrifice varied, and none should be judged ill, as long as they maintained a proper degree of patriotism. This latter attitude perhaps underpins Laura Cooke's performance of music in the family parlor. Yes, some women owned more patriotic music for their binders volumes, albeit not as many as popular summations would have us believe. Significantly, money and class position were often a deciding factor. In the examples I have brought to light here, money and patriotic music worked in an inverse proportion. This small sampling of women's musicking during the Civil War suggests that the more affluent the family, the less ardently patriotic the music collection, even for those whose fathers were vested heavily in the quotidian running of a wartime administration. There remains much to be said about music during the Civil War. In her 2020 dissertation, Karen Stafford writes that women collected music that spoke to them as patriots, but also spoke to them personally during the war, finding that ballads that referenced men far away fighting or celebrated valiant military leaders helped connect them in ways they had not felt prior to the war. This is certainly true in some cases, but not all. Laura Cooke's collection and the Blair House volumes manifest something different, something that distinguishes music of the Civil War from music during the Civil War. The process of musicking in the homes of politically influential men, like Jay Cooke and Montgomery Blair, by their daughters and other members of their circles, supports the view put forward by Gallman and others that there was a wide variety of responses in the North as to women's role during the war, and a wider one than music historians have described. It may also lend some credence to the familiar 1863 phrase about a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Indeed, Jay Cooke is one of the men historian David Nassau mentions in this regard in his biography of Andrew Carnegie. Maybe Laura Cooke didn't pay much attention to the war because she didn't have to. As a proper upper-class young woman, she kept pursuing the accomplishments needed to marry the right man. This is not to say that Laura ignored the conflict. She compassionately wrote that an 1868 performance of the play The Drummer Boy or the Battle of Shiloh was, quote, too awfully sad and true to life, end quote. Although theater historian Bethany Holmstrom argues her sympathetic commentary reflected a culture of imitation as defined by Miles Orville, since Laura could not have known how true the rendering was. And she did on 11 compositions that dealt directly with the war. But my point is that Civil War music does not figure prominently in her extensive collection, and it could have, had the intention been there. Perhaps her father didn't wish to hear things that reminded him of the war when he spent time with the family, or her mother or teacher instructed her to be more entertaining. In other words, did Laura, and Minna for that matter, silence the guns of war by performing music that had nothing to do with it in the parlor? We can get a sense of Laura's music performances and her personality from her sheet music. Many have evidence of use, as these two illustrate. I'm particularly interested in the Italian aria, with the assistance added for the Italian language and note alignment, and the little cadenza. These 3 pages reflect 3 types of pieces she played: the colorful, modern imagery from Faust, the older German edition of Mozart's piano music, and the classic collections edition of Chopin's Waltz in D flat, another unlikely find in an American's volume of this period. On the American Cousin Schottische, she wrote a note to Jenny, revealing that they shared music, maintaining a common antebellum habit among friends. Not all of Laura's endeavors were serious, as we can see from the frivolous drawings on the pages here, as well as her flirtatious comment on Ernani, Fly With Me, to which she has added, certainly, avec plaisir. I have seen several such intimate conversations penciled on sheet music, almost all of which would have displeased a chaperone had she heard it. All of these images substantiate the need to look beyond titles and composers to discern women's culture, their personhood, and their use of music as a palliative instead of a rallying cry. Whatever the reasons, Laura Cooke's music collections admonishes us to recognize that when we speak of Civil War music, it is not all guns and glory, nor is it weeping women in the parlor. There was also the need to escape, to get away, to think about something other than the war. Men and women naturally resorted to coping mechanisms they had learned before the war, women pleasing listeners by performing music in the parlor. Of course, men performed as well, but we don't hear about that as often. The repertory was opera excerpts by Rossini, Donizetti, Meyerbeer, or Gounod, favorite songs of the 1850s, or similarly styled new ones of the 60s, and dance music published in the United States, more than it was battles, heroes, and loss. None of the works known as battle pieces survives in these collections. They seem rather to reflect a desire to maintain life the way it was before the conflict began, to provide a sense of normalcy. I'll turn to the final musical excerpt now, the opening of Ferdinand Bayer's Il Trovatore from his Opus 42, and ask you again to put yourself in a parlor, now at Blair House, and imagine Minna playing a piano in this room. This is a modern image, not one of the period. The excerpt is almost 5 minutes in length, and I think you might recognize Verdi's music. Music and trauma studies in this period have focused on the use of music as therapy in battlegrounds and hospitals, a concept credited to Florence Nightingale's innovations of the previous decade. It is possible to read the collections described here as a different therapy, one for which there's ample evidence of practice, but not enough research to date. Music to reduce stress at home, as we can imagine the Blair and Cooke homes experienced. From the time they began their training to become ladies, young women were instructed that they performed music in the parlor as a way of providing a pleasing environment for male family members, especially those in white-collar positions held by men such as Montgomery Blair and Jay Cooke. Singing songs by Franz Schubert or Stephen Glover's or a number of American composers, playing Mendelssohn's Songs Without Words or waltzes by Thomas Browne, and adaptations of Gounod's Faust throughout the early 1860s was a natural application of what they had always been taught, providing a pleasant and enjoyable atmosphere for others. We are familiar with scenes of men being moved, enthusiastically or nostalgically, by music in camp. There is much more, however. The musical examples heard in this lecture are as much a part of the soundscape of the Civil War as any others. A comparison of three women and their music collections, Minna Blair, Annie Houseal, and Laura Cooke, illustrates the breadth of information we can learn by looking more closely at binders volumes. Was the Union woman during the war, if she ever existed, one who attempted to make ends meet by teaching and doing whatever she needed to do musically, with whatever repertory her clients desired, as Annie Halsell appears to have done? Did she entertain her father's colleagues with extended arrangements of melodies from Bellini's La Sonnambula, which Minna Blair surely played in Blair House when her father entertained? Was she a young teenager learning to be a lady, but also taking the time to draw silly pictures in her music, as Laura Cooke did? Thousands of young women found themselves trying to negotiate the transition between childhood and womanhood between 1861 and 1865, in whatever social position they found themselves. And for some, this too changed dramatically during the war, especially in the South. Music of the Civil War did not always preoccupy them, either by their own choice or by what others wished to hear. Music's power to silence the sounds and even the ideas of war granted young women agentic capacity during the Civil War. The examples brought to light here caution that we cannot pretend to know music during the Civil War without examining such materials, and an excellent place to begin is the Library of Congress and its rich collection of binders volumes in the Music Division.